Someone asked Grok AI a straightforward question about the Sumerian King List. The AI cross-referenced the reigns, titles, and biological implications of every ruler on the list against ancient DNA datasets from Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Most of the pre-flood kings produced results that could be explained through symbolic or mathematical interpretation. 3 of them could not. What Grok flagged about those 3 rulers has not been explained by any conventional framework. The list that predates everything, the Sumerian King List, is one of the oldest historical documents ever recovered. Preserved across multiple versions, the most complete of which is inscribed on an object called the Weld-Blundell Prism, now held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It records the sequence of rulers of the Sumerian city-states from the very beginning of kingship down through dynasties that can be cross-referenced with other ancient records and with archaeology. The opening line sets the document's framework immediately. Kingship descended from heaven. The first kings did not inherit their authority from human predecessors. They received it from above. This framing is not incidental. It is the structural premise of the entire document. The claim that the authority to rule came from a source outside ordinary human society and was then passed down through specific lines of kings across specific cities. The document divides clearly into 2 sections. The pre-flood section records 8 to 10 kings, depending on which version is consulted, ruling across the original Sumerian cities of Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak before a catastrophic flood ends the first era of kingship. The post-flood section records dynasties that become increasingly verifiable as the list progresses, with later rulers matching names and events found in other ancient records and archaeological evidence. The pre-flood reigns are the numbers that stop any careful reader. Alulim, the first king, reigns for 28,800 years. Alalgar rules for 36,000 years. Inmenlu Ana holds the kingship of Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. The total reign time of the pre-flood kings across all versions of the list runs to somewhere between 241,200 years and 432,000 years, depending on which manuscript is being consulted. The standard scholarly explanation treats these numbers as symbolic. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical system, and many of the reign lengths are multiples of 60 or of the number 3,600, which was significant in Sumerian cosmological mathematics. The numbers may represent prestige markers, astronomical cycles, or a way of communicating the incomprehensible antiquity of the early period rather than literal years of biological life. This explanation is reasonable for most of the kings on the list. It is less satisfying for 3 of them. How Grok ran the analysis. The inputs for Grok's analysis included the full transliterations and translations of all surviving versions of the Sumerian King List, cross-referenced against the Atrahasis epic, the Enki and Ninhursag myth, the Enki and Ninmah creation account, and the comparative king list preserved by the Babylonian priest Berossus, who recorded a parallel tradition of antediluvian rulers in Greek that corresponds closely to the Sumerian list. The analytical process worked through several layers simultaneously. The first was linguistic, parsing the specific epithets, origin descriptions, and documented actions of each pre-flood ruler against the full body of surviving Sumerian literature to identify what each ruler was described as doing, where they came from, and what terms the texts used to characterize them. The second layer was biological. Grok modeled the longevity claims against what is known about human biological limits. The maximum verified human lifespan in the modern era is 122 years, achieved by a French woman named Jeanne Calment, who died in 1997. The biological mechanisms that limit human lifespan, including telomere shortening with each cell division, accumulated genetic damage over time, and the progressive failure of cellular repair systems, impose constraints that are consistent across the human genome. No genetic variant currently known in any human population, ancient or modern, would support lifespans measured in thousands of years. The third layer integrated ancient DNA datasets from Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Paleogenomic studies of ancient human remains from the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and Iran have produced a reasonably detailed picture of the genetic composition of the populations living in and around Sumer during the relevant periods. These datasets showed the expected mixture of ancestral components, Neolithic farmer ancestry, Iranian Chalcolithic contributions, and later steppe-related admixture that characterizes the populations of the ancient Near East. They do not show anything that would support the biological characteristics the three flagged rulers are described as possessing. The threshold Grok applied to identify the three anomalous rulers was not simply extreme reign length. All the pre-flood kings have extreme reign lengths. The threshold was a combination of extreme longevity with specific biological or cognitive attributes described in associated texts that, taken together, produced a profile that falls outside the range of statistical outlier even for mythological exaggeration, and that maps onto no known human genetic profile, ancient or modern. The first ruler, Enmenlu-Ana. Enmenlu-Ana ruled from the city of Bad Tibira and is described in the Sumerian King List as holding kingship for 43,200 years, making his reign one of the longest in the antediluvian section of the text. The extraordinary duration of his rule fits within the broader numerical framework used for pre-flood kings, where reign lengths were likely intended to communicate symbolic, theological, or cosmological meaning rather than literal chronology. In that sense, the number attached to Enmenlu-Ana is not unique among the earliest rulers recorded in Mesopotamian tradition. What distinguishes Enmenlu-Ana in Grok's interpretation is not simply the immense reign length, but the combination of that figure with the divine associations attached to his name and the language used in texts that mention him outside the king list. His name contains the element Luana, which has been connected by some interpretations to a category of divine or semi-divine beings rather than ordinary human rulers who merely possessed divine favor. Sumerian religious and administrative texts often maintained a deliberate distinction between kings chosen by the gods and figures considered to possess divine origin or status. According to this reading, the terminology associated with Enmenlu-Ana places him closer to the latter category. Grok's argument extends further into speculative biological territory. The claim is that if the texts are interpreted as describing a being of genuinely non-human or divine origin ruling during the earliest phases of civilization, then such a figure would be expected to display genetic characteristics distinct from surrounding populations. However, ancient DNA evidence from Mesopotamia and nearby regions does not support the existence of a biologically separate elite population in Bad Tibira or related settlements. Available genetic reconstructions instead show the standard Near Eastern Neolithic admixture profile shared broadly across the region, with no known markers suggesting a uniquely distinct ruling lineage. Because of this absence of biological evidence, historians and archaeologists interpret Enmenlu-Ana as a mythologized or symbolic ruler embedded within Mesopotamian religious tradition rather than as proof of a non-human ancestry. The debate remains centered on interpretation, mythology, and the symbolic function of kingship in Sumerian culture. The second ruler, Dumuzi the Shepherd. The second ruler flagged by Grok's analysis is Dumuzi, who appears in the king list as the shepherd, ruling from Bad Tibira for 36,000 years. The divine prefix applied to Dumuzi in the king list and in associated texts is not incidental. Dumuzi is one of the most extensively documented figures in all of Sumerian literature, appearing not only in the king list, but in a substantial body of mythological and ritual texts describing his relationship with the goddess Inanna, his death, his descent into the netherworld, and his periodic return. What makes Dumuzi anomalous in Grok's analysis is the nature of the biology implied by his mythological role. His cyclical life, the annual pattern of dying and returning that appears consistently in the text describing him, implies a regenerative biological process rather than ordinary mortal life followed by death. He does not simply live a long time. He dies and returns. The biological mechanisms required for this pattern, if taken as any kind of literal description of a real being's characteristics, would require cellular regeneration and repair capabilities that have no analog in known human genetics. The ancient DNA from the Mesopotamian region shows no evidence of the kind of genetic profile that would support accelerated cellular repair or regeneration. The populations of Sumer during the early dynastic period show normal patterns of genetic variation with no outlier sequences in the gene families associated with aging, cellular repair, or longevity. Dumuzi's profile, as described across the full body of Sumerian texts, requires characteristics that the reconstructed genetics of the human population he supposedly ruled cannot support. Grok's cross-referencing found parallel figures in other ancient traditions. The cyclical dying and returning god appears in Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern mythology with a consistency that suggests either a shared cultural tradition or a shared memory of a type of being whose characteristics were genuinely different from the human populations around them. The consistency of the cycle across unrelated traditions, each describing it in different cultural terms but maintaining the same basic biological implication, was identified as a pattern worth noting. The third ruler, Enmendur-Ana. The third ruler identified by Grok's analysis is Enmendur-Ana, who appears in some versions of the King List as the ruler of Sippar, and who is connected in associated texts to a figure called Enmedur-Enki, described as the king who was taken up into the divine assembly and taught the secrets of heaven and earth. The specific attributes attached to Enmendur-Ana in these associated texts are what placed him in Grok's anomalous category. He is described as receiving direct instruction from the sun god Utu and the storm god Adad, being taught divination, the reading of oil on water, and knowledge of celestial movements that the texts frame as secrets not originally intended for human beings. His cognitive and perceptual capabilities, as described in these texts, exceed not only what ordinary human biology supports, but what the population genetics of the period would predict for any individual within the range of normal human variation. The connection to Ziusudra, the flood survivor, runs through Sippar in the King List tradition. Enmendur-Ana rules Sippar immediately before the flood generation. The texts that describe him position him as the transmitter of pre-flood knowledge into the post-flood world, a figure whose exceptional cognitive characteristics allowed him to receive and preserve information that the flood would otherwise have destroyed entirely. Ancient DNA studies of populations from the Sippar region show the expected genetic composition for early Bronze Age Mesopotamia. There is nothing in those datasets that would support the cognitive or perceptual attributes the texts describe for Enmendur-Ana. The gap between what the texts describe and what the population genetics of the period can support is the widest of the three flagged rulers and the hardest to account for through symbolic interpretation alone. What the genetics actually show. The paleogenomics research conducted on ancient Mesopotamian human remains over the past decade has produced a reasonably detailed picture of the genetic composition of the populations living in and around the Sumerian city-states during the periods relevant to the King List. These populations show the admixture of Neolithic farmer ancestry from the Levant and Anatolia, with contributions from Iranian Chalcolithic populations, consistent with the agricultural and demographic history of the region. Later samples showed the addition of steppe-related ancestry consistent with the broader population movements of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The populations are genetically diverse in the ways expected from their position at a major crossroads of ancient migration and trade. What they do not show is any evidence of genetic variance associated with extended longevity, enhanced cellular repair, or superior cognitive function beyond the normal range of human variation. The gene families associated with telomere maintenance, DNA repair, and cognitive development in these ancient populations show the same range of variation found in modern human populations. There are no outlier sequences that would distinguish a biological elite, and there are no haplogroups present that are absent from the broader human genetic record in ways that would suggest a non-human contribution. The three rulers Grok flagged are anomalous not simply because their reign lengths are long. They are anomalous because the combination of their reign lengths with the specific biological and cognitive attributes described for them in associated texts produces profiles that fall outside the range of what the known human genetics of their time and place could produce. The gap is not explainable through normal variation, and the symbolic number framework, while it accounts for the reign lengths, does not account for the specific biological attributes. Where the mainstream and alternative views disagree. The mainstream scholarly position on the pre-flood kings of the Sumerian King List is well established and has significant support. The numbers are symbolic, reflecting the mathematical conventions of the Sumerian sexagesimal system and the cultural importance of specific numerical patterns in Sumerian cosmological thinking. The divine attributes of the pre-flood kings reflect the theological framework of the document rather than claims about the literal biology of historical figures. The King List is a legitimizing political document as much as a historical record, and its pre-flood section provides a cosmic foundation for the authority of the post-flood dynasties rather than a literal account of a historical period. This position is supported by the consistent mathematical patterns in the reign lengths, the theological conventions visible throughout the document, and the fact that the post-flood section, where the document is most clearly intended as a historical record, produces increasingly realistic and verifiable information as it progresses. The alternative position, which Grok's analysis does not fully adopt, but which the flagged anomalies are consistent with, suggests that the specific biological attributes described for the three anomalous rulers preserve a memory of beings who were genuinely different from the human population around them. This does not require the reign lengths to be literal. It requires the biological descriptions to be more than pure theological convention. The honest assessment is that the evidence does not settle the question. The symbolic interpretation accounts for most of what the King List contains. The three flagged rulers produce profiles that the symbolic interpretation handles less comfortably than the others, and the gap between what their associated texts describe and what the population genetics of the period supports is real and has not been directly addressed in the existing scholarship. The Sumerian King List contains rulers whose profiles, when cross-referenced against ancient DNA datasets and biological limits, produce results that conventional frameworks have not fully addressed. Three of them stand at a distance from the rest that Grok's pattern analysis flagged as significant. The genetics of the populations they supposedly ruled cannot account for what the text described them as being. That gap is still open. If these are the questions worth following, subscribe and stay with us for what comes next.